Hey everybody, welcome to the channel. My name's Paul, and what I'm going to be doing in this video is explaining why I think naturalism and moral realism are incompatible. Now, if you don't know what these words mean, I'll go ahead and define them for you, but I don't think if you don't know what these words mean, I don't know if this is a good video for you to watch, because they can be a little bit technical, although I'll go through hopefully some of the history so it is accessible. So the idea is naturalism is this idea that all that exists in the natural world are just physical laws, like the laws of nature and matter. So there's nothing spooky, there's no afterlife. Generally, naturalists don't believe in gods, they're atheists and things like that. They just don't believe these are real. And also, moral realism is the stance that moral propositions or moral language can express true propositions about the world. So the example philosophers love to give is murdering babies for fun is wrong. Is that a statement that can actually be true, or like a real statement? And there are alternatives to moral realism, which I'll talk a little bit about. And what I'm going to be doing is, I don't want to say I'm arguing that these two are incompatible as much as just sharing my thoughts as to why I think they're incompatible, and to sort of put the ball in the naturalist court who try to reconcile these two, some of the challenges that I see trying to put these two together. I'm not trying to say I have a knockdown argument or anything. I just am going to explore my thoughts as to why these two are incompatible in my opinion. So if you're a naturalist and a moral nihilist, you're actually off the hook. I think that's a pretty reasonable position to have. It's not a satisfying position to me, and I think even most moral nihilists still have moral emotions. They just don't believe those emotions are necessarily true. So moral nihilism is the idea that just there is no such thing as right or wrong, and we're just making all this stuff up. There are no objective values. There's just kind of either opinions or feelings or these sorts of things, but they don't track truth. And we'll talk a little bit more about this as we get into it. So if you're actually a naturalist and you don't believe there are such things as real morality or objective morality or factual morality, you're fine. This video is really not for you. Maybe this will even entrench you a little bit more, because I think what I'm providing here is a slightly different perspective into this naturalism, moral realism debate. So it's going to sound like I'm taking shots at secular morality, and in particular secular humanism, which I think is probably the biggest form of secular morality out there, and the biggest practical form of secular morality. And I want you to take this as a communal activity, not as an adversarial one. I don't want you to think I'm really coming after you with the intention of arguing that your point is, or your views are just stupid or dumb or anything like that. Instead, see this as me coming to this with pure Christian brotherly love, and saying that if we can solve this dispute and we can have this conversation, I'm not claiming I'm making a knockdown argument, but if I can raise these challenges and you guys can answer these challenges, then we'll be in a really good position. And I'll vouch for you. If you can answer to these, I'll totally admit, I'll be like, hey, look, I had these objections to secular morality or secular humanism from a metaethical standpoint. They were answered by secular humanists or by metaethicists. Yeah, that's the word. And I think it's totally rational. I'll have your back. Really, I'll have your back. But instead, even though it's going to seem like I'm attacking this position, take this as me thinking that that's a valuable process. And part of this comes from the fact that some of the secular people that have challenged me on my views of Christianity have done a great service to me, have done a great service to my beliefs by challenging them, by me subjecting my beliefs to questioning and challenging, not in a sort of ridiculing way, but in a difficult way where you subject your views to sort of, you take your epistemology and you shake it a little bit, and whatever falls off wasn't that strong, and whatever stays, you can be confident that it's pretty strong. So that's enough of what I'll say about that. And I'm not making an apologetics argument here, although you could take this and turn it into an apologetics argument very easily, I think. If you agree with my premise and some of the arguments that I'm making, that's not really what I'm going to do, because I don't really see myself as doing very much apologetics. I'm not an expert in this area, but you could do it. You totally could. I'm just going to put that out there, but that's not what I'm doing. So one of the questions I want you to keep in the back of your head as we go through this is the question of what makes humans worthy of equal consideration. This isn't really a metaethical question. Well, I guess it kind of is. But is this the sort of question we can falsify, or what evidence would lead us to believe that humans are either worthy of equal consideration or not? And taking this a step further, why should I treat others as if they have equal value to me when they obviously do not? And once again, this is this idea of we need a reason to convince people that they should treat other people as equal. Because, and I'm not saying I believe this, but what I'm saying is different people have different value to me and my own ends than others. Some people can help me a lot with what I want to achieve, and other people don't have as much use to me. So convincing me that I should treat other people as my moral equal or treat other people the same as each other is an interesting kind of claim. And you can actually ask that same question as why should society treat others as if they have equal value to society when some people seem to be able to contribute more to society than others. And this kind of gets into a little bit of political philosophy and these sorts of things. So I want this to be the question you have in the back of your head. Can you give somebody a reason? Can you justify equality for them? And can you justify equality for them under naturalism or not? This is just kind of me setting the stage. And here's what I would consider to be the fundamental challenge of morality. I experience my own pleasure and pain different from how I experience the pleasure and pain of others. Now, I'm not going to argue that all of morality can be basically reduced to just pleasure and pain, but I'm going to kind of talk about it in this sense for now, because this is the challenge, right? Me getting a paper cut and me having that experience is different from me experiencing somebody else getting a paper cut, which is different from me knowing that there's somewhere halfway across the globe, somebody else getting a paper cut. And I experience that differently. So any challenge that wants to convince me that I should care or need to care or have an obligation or a duty to care or do something about this is going to be going up against this fundamental challenge. And George Scher, who's a moral philosopher, he's actually the person who taught me ethics, puts it like this. Morality usually involves asking us to do things we just don't want to do. And because it makes these demands of us, or it often does, we hope that if morality is going to be rational, it's able to give us a reason to care or to adjust or align our desires with the pleasure and pain of others, other people, animals, etc., etc. And some of the main ideas I want to talk about here are, and this is just the main idea, like right here. Do we have reasons, like actual rational reasons, to believe that certain things are right or wrong outside of our own feelings about them? Or are our feelings just the only thing that we have? And this really just has to do with metaethics and moral epistemology. It's not about any specific moral code. It's about how can our moral sense be reliable at discovering propositions about morality, such as the rightness or wrongness of actions. And here's the main idea that I see from naturalism is often associated with these evolutionary debunking arguments, or what we call EDAs, which basically argue that they can give a good account of the origin of moral belief. And do they attack moral epistemology so strongly under naturalism that morality can even get what I would say off the ground? So really what I mean by this is, if naturalism is true, is it even possible that our moral sense could have a function that tracks truth? So, right, we see something, we assume our vision is maybe flawed, but it can actually guide us to true things. Our moral sense or our moral epistemology, or maybe let's say even reason or rationality, can these even guide us to true facts or propositions about morality? Or if evolution is true, and by evolution I mean specifically this sort of neo-Darwinian, unguided naturalistic evolution, is it possible that our moral beliefs can be true? Can we even say something meaningful about morality? And here's, I think, the challenge. This is where I think if you're a secular humanist, or you're somebody who's secular who does believe in moral realism, but you're also a naturalist, where you can really push at this argument here, where you can really counter what I'm saying. Because to me, it seems odd to accept an evolutionary account for religious beliefs, but not moral beliefs. So there are evolutionary debunking arguments for religious beliefs, which basically make the claim that all of religious beliefs can be explained as an evolutionary adaptation and without actually tracking any true propositions. And likewise, you can make evolutionary debunking arguments for the belief in moral things, like the idea of right and wrong, or duty or obligation, but these concepts, without reference to these concepts actually being true, without there actually being any such thing as right or wrong, or any property is right or wrong. And the challenge is to people who are secular, I guess, ethicists, is how do you make this not seem like special pleading? I think if you don't think an evolutionary account is sufficient for accepting religious beliefs, then I think it's very fair to say, okay, it doesn't explain our religious beliefs and it doesn't explain our moral beliefs. That's fine. But if you're going to accept evolutionary accounts for religious beliefs and not moral beliefs, and also keep in mind that religious and moral beliefs are really closely tied together and very difficult to separate, how can we make this not seem like special pleading? I think if you're a secular humanist or you're just an atheist who believes in moral realism, this is my challenge to you. How can you make this not seem like special pleading? And I would like you to convince me. I would like you to respond to this because I find this conversation fascinating. I've thought a lot about this. Of course, if you're agnostic about naturalism, if you're like, I generally assume naturalism is true, but I don't know or I'm not sure, I think you get a backdoor, because then you could say, well, maybe it's possible that there are such things as moral facts, or maybe it is possible that there are some sort of supernatural entities that sort of are able to guide our moral beliefs to true propositions about the world. And I think that's fine. I think when I say you get a backdoor, you can use that agnosticism as a backdoor where you don't have to say, okay, we're just going to assume that evolution is able to perfectly explain religious and moral beliefs and just accept it, or one and the other. If you're kind of agnostic, well, we don't know. You can, of course, get a backdoor. So once again, this is about hardcore metaphysical naturalism, not necessarily agnostic metaphysical naturalism, where you're like, it generally seems this is true, but I'm not sure. And of course, we have an interesting question here. What if you had to choose between naturalism and certain things actually being wrong? If you had to choose, would there be one you'd choose? Would you be open to either one being true? Would you be open to, or maybe I should put it this way. Are you so attached to naturalism that you'd be willing to give up the rightness or wrongness of certain actions like rape or murder to be attached to naturalism? Or are you so attached to certain things just being wrong and wrongness being a property that if these two were in conflict, you'd be willing to give up naturalism? Kind of an interesting question. I just pose that for you to think about. So here's Mackie's argument from queerness. It's a really famous argument in metaethics. It's gotten a lot of contemporary attention too. This is by the wonderful philosopher J.L. Mackie. I'm a fan. I don't know what you say in philosophy, but even though I disagree with Mackie on a lot of things, for one, he's just an atheist and I'm a Christian, but I have a lot of deep respect for him. And I think this argument is very, very interesting. His argument from queerness is basically making the argument that if there were ethical properties, they would kind of be strange, or what he calls queer. They're different than anything else. And he says it like this: there are no objective values. If there were objective values, then they would be entities or qualities that are kind of a very strange sort, utterly different from anything else in the universe. And he goes on to say, we might as well argue that objectively, intrinsically perspective features supervening upon natural ones constitute so odd a cluster of qualities and relations that they are most unlikely to have arisen in the ordinary course of events without an all-powerful God to create them. So Mackie, I think, in these quotes, is underlining how difficult it is to be a naturalist and a moral realist. And there are a lot of people in contemporary metaethics who take Mackie's skepticism very seriously, and these include people like Richard Joyce, and I'm actually currently trying to convince my philosophy department and Richard Joyce to come over and give a talk, because Richard Joyce does a lot of contemporary work on Mackie and these evolutionary debunking arguments, and I'd like to talk to him about this stuff. But I think Mackie's argument is very compelling to me, because he's basically saying, okay, if there were such things as right or wrong, what kind of quantities would they be, and how would we know if they were true? And we'll go a little bit more into this, but I'm just going to start with just Mackie's quote and his argument from queerness, because I think it's an excellent argument. I think it brings up something really interesting about morality. So, of course, we need to look into moral language a little bit when we're talking about metaethics. Can moral propositions, such as certain things being right or wrong, actually be true? What I mean is, when I say murdering babies for fun is wrong, what do I actually mean by that statement? Am I making a proposition that can be evaluated to be either true or false? Or am I expressing something else by using my moral language, by communicating what I'm saying when I make a moral proposition or a moral claim? And of course, whether we think moral claims reflect truth or not, or whether they try to manipulate our behavior, is actually going to change how we act. So if we think when somebody says something, they're actually stating a fact, we may believe them. If we think instead they're not stating a fact and they're instead trying to change our behavior, that's going to change how we respond and therefore how we act. If somebody says, for instance, to me, Paul, you like vanilla ice cream, but chocolate ice cream is better. And I realize that they're trying to convince me to order chocolate ice cream and not vanilla ice cream, or like chocolate ice cream and not vanilla ice cream. But I realize they can't give me a good reason, then I'm going to continue ordering vanilla ice cream. But if somebody tells me, hey, Paul, like your idea about, I don't know, gravity or something is wrong, and here is the truth about the matter, and I'm able to see that I'm wrong about it, like this is actually a fact, it's going to actually change my behavior and change whether or not this is the case. If somebody makes a good case for why I should order chocolate ice cream, or why chocolate ice cream is objectively better than vanilla ice cream and it's more than my preference, then that is going to change how I act. And Mackie's also famous for coming up with this idea of error theory, which is his idea that just all moral claims are false. They're truth evaluatable, which means if I say murdering babies for fun is wrong, that's actually a proposition. But what Mackie is saying is that it's a false, all moral claims are completely false. They're actually truth evaluatable, but they just all tend to evaluate to false, so they're all erroneous. And then you got A.J. Ayer, who makes the argument that right and wrong are just statements of preference, and he's an emotivist, which basically means when you make a moral claim, all you're doing is expressing your own feelings towards something. So if I say murdering babies for fun is wrong, the emotivist is going to say, no. Wrongness isn't a property of the universe. What you're just saying is expressing your dislike for murdering babies. You're just saying you don't like it. Really, really influential work. And Ayer kind of comes out of this logical positivist view, which we can talk a little bit more about in another video, I guess. And then you have desirism, which is the sort of modern version of preference utilitarianism. I don't even want to go too far into that. But it's basically the idea of actually replacing moral language with emotivist language. So desirism is this idea that, hey, we accept that moral claims are just kind of, you could either be an error theorist and say they're all false, or you could sort of be a non-cognitivist, or you basically say moral claims don't mean anything. So why be explicit about it? Why not just say, hey, rather than saying, murdering babies for fun is wrong, actually replacing that statement with the statement of emotivism. This is the way that I interpret it. So you're just basically saying, rather than saying murdering babies for fun is wrong, you're actually saying what you mean if you believe that emotivism is all that is being said from moral claims, and you just say, I don't like murdering babies for fun. I think I don't like it. You can't say it's wrong because wrongness isn't a property of the universe. So we'll address this claim, you can be good without God, that you hear from a lot of secular humanists. And I'll explain why I have a concern with this claim, and it doesn't actually come from, I kind of agree and disagree with it. So let's see if we can unpack what this proposition is. Can you? First proposition, a good person is one who does X, Y, and Z. Proposition 2, someone who does X, Y, and Z someone can do X, Y, and Z, where we can just define what this is, can do this without reference to or belief in God, and therefore one can be good without God. So this is a very standard logic. You have premise 1, premise 2, and it just follows from these premises, if they're correct, that the conclusion follows. And where I take issue with this actually isn't proposition 2. I think most theists would actually argue, and you can even make a very solid biblical case to this for proposition 2. Of course, people who don't believe in or explicitly know God can actually do this thing. And therefore, where I think me and a lot of other theists have issues is with proposition 1. Is this even coherent? And the question we can ask is, what is good, and why is a good person one who does X, Y, and Z and not something else, A, B, and C? In other words, what's your epistemology for knowing that a good person is one who does X, Y, and Z? And most of the time, where you see this is people saying a good person is one who believes in the sort of Western notions of equality, egalitarianism, so on and so forth. The difficulty is justifying why that is sort of a good thing, or why other people should agree with this, and can you give them good reasons to agree with this? So we'll talk a little bit more about this. So actually what I'm going to claim, and this is sort of what I'm going to say, is this claim that a good or well-functioning person is one who does X, Y, and Z, or blank, is actually a teleological claim. And this comes from Alasdair MacIntyre and his work in After Virtue. Because, of course, we need to ask, what is a good or well-functioning person? And why should we agree with somebody's definition of this versus somebody else's? Or do these just come down to personal preference? Of course, we can also ask, by what authority does anyone have to make such a claim? Is this a claim that a person makes, a society makes, that God makes? Where does this claim come from? And we run into Hume's is-ought distinction. So Alasdair MacIntyre's point, and I did find this very compelling, is basically you have human nature as it is. And ethics gets you from human nature as it is, or maybe ethics, maybe virtue, gets you from human nature as it is to human nature as it should be or as it ought to be. And what MacIntyre is claiming is that ever since the Enlightenment, we've kind of gotten away with what a human ought to be, and we only have human nature as it is. And that's why, in his view, all contemporary moral discourse is just fundamentally flawed and nonsensical. Because you don't have an aim that you're aiming for, or you don't have a justified end that you're aiming for. And I think secular humanists kind of get around this by claiming that the end that they're aiming for is this fundamental equality for all human beings. The question comes in, how do we justify this, or what's the epistemology of this, and does this fit under naturalism? And we kind of have Hume's really famous is-ought distinction coming up. We can observe what is, but how do we get from what is to what ought to be? In some ways, saying you can be good without God, to me, is kind of like saying, well, you can act in accordance with Judeo-Christian values without actually identifying as a Jew, Christian, or Muslim. And this is where I'm going to be a little harsh. To me, this is like saying you can act as if fairy tales are true without believing they're true. Because if you believe all religious claims or all these ideas are just fairy tales or they're all false, then why are you changing your behavior to live in accordance with these values if you don't believe they're true? Or what's your fundamental reasoning for believing that a good or well-functioning person is one who treats other people equally? And does that include animals? You can imagine, to me, if you're a naturalist, you have this sort of if you believe in universal common descent, which I do, which is like basically you have life and you have all these different species coming down, you draw the line right at the species level as humans, not later at the racial level or at the familial level, or not earlier to include, other primates or other animals. And to me, it just feels a little arbitrary. So you need some sort of ought or some sort of should, like a good person is one who respects all human life as equal or something like that. So continuing on here, it's actually, I'd even go further and say it's irrational to live according to values you do not believe it exists, especially if it infringes on your own desires. So basically that's like saying, okay, if I don't believe that equality is a fundamental property of the universe, why should I live as if this is true if I doubt the epistemology that led me to believe this is true? Why am I accepting this sort of golden rule, treat other people the way I want to be treated, if I don't believe that's a real statement or a true statement? And I'd argue it's irrational to do this. That'd be like saying somebody comes up to me and I like vanilla ice cream and they like chocolate ice cream. And they come up to me and they say, Paul, chocolate ice cream is better than vanilla ice cream for these reasons. And I think their reasons are wrong. Right? I'm like, no. It's all personal preference. But yet I still go from ordering vanilla ice cream to ordering chocolate ice cream. Because even though I disagree with their reasons, I feel good to be accepted by them or for them to think that. I don't know why I do it. But to me, that's irrational. And to me, it would be irrational to accept these sort of religious values while you're pulling the rug under yourself and saying, I don't believe these things actually exist, or that goodness or virtue is a property of the universe or anything like that, or that any teleology could exist. And in some ways, this is the point MacIntyre makes, you're actually using others as a means to an end if you convince them to follow your moral code if you believe it's completely made up, or you believe you don't have any reasons to follow it. Basically, it's like if I believe that vanilla ice cream is no better than chocolate ice cream, and I convince my friends to start ordering vanilla ice cream, even though they like chocolate ice cream better, I think we would argue, because I can't give them a good reason to do this, that I'm basically manipulating them. They like chocolate ice cream better than vanilla. And I know I can't give them a reason to like vanilla better than chocolate because it's just personal preference. So how can I get them to change their behavior to start liking vanilla ice cream or to start ordering it if I don't believe vanilla ice cream is actually inherently superior? Kind of an interesting point. That's MacIntyre's point. I think it's very compelling. So my claim, so this is really where my claim is that teleological claims are supernatural claims. So basically saying that a good functioning human is X, Y, and Z, we can't get this, I don't think we can get this teleology from naturalism. You can get it from revealed religion. You can say, okay, if God created all this stuff and he somehow happened to either supervene on our moral beliefs so they could track truth, or he came down and he, had prophets or wrote a book, or, you can make any of these claims, right? Any of these claims. Then you are making, in some sense, you're allowing for the possibility of a supernatural teleology. Otherwise, where can this teleology come from if it's not natural? And I think that's the challenge, right? Religion, especially revealed religion, offers a backdoor for teleological claims to exist. If you deny the epistemology of religion, then you're denying the epistemology that serves to justify teleological claims. So if you're going to deny those, you need some other way to make a teleological claim that, in my view, or MacIntyre's view, would allow morality to function. So the question was, where do we find it? MacIntyre's point, once again, is that if emotivism is true, others are always means to your own ends. And we'll go a little bit farther. Using words like good and evil to describe actions without actually believing that good and evil exists is manipulative. And I'd argue this is an appropriation of language. This is like saying, okay, I don't believe that good and evil exist, but I'm going to use these terms to try to get other people to change their behavior in accordance to my desires, even though all I believe is that morality itself is just what we want and there's no actual truth to it. I'd argue that's manipulation, and it's appropriating language from other people for kind of, I don't want to say sinister purposes, because I guess you don't believe that it's wrong, but it's just manipulation. So your morality has to involve manipulating people because you can't believe you can give them an actual justifiable reason to do this. And furthermore, you're co-opting words from people who actually believe things like good and evil exist and using this language, even though you don't believe it yourself, to try to manipulate their behavior. And to me, there's just something so unsatisfying about this. And once again, convincing others to adopt your metaethical view or kind of smuggling teleology into moral claims to change their behavior is also manipulative. So in other words, telling people they should do something, even if while understanding that there is no such thing as shoulds, or there's no God to tell us what we should do, is another manipulative sort of thing, because I would guess you would deny the epistemology of any should. So once again, it's manipulation. So this is, once again, morality is there to manipulate our behavior, and that's what all moral claims come down to. If our moral sense is completely and entirely determined by unguided natural selection, we really don't have any way of arbitrating between different teleological moral claims. Some people say a good functioning human is this, others say a good functioning human is that. You have no way of determining one being better than another. There's no standard. There's nothing to measure it against. It's just, to me, it's a bunch of I don't want to say it's a bunch of nonsense. It's a strong word. And I'm using strong language here, and I don't mean it to be done in an attacking, manipulative, or ridiculing way. I mean nonsense in literal nonsense. It's like different flavors of ice cream. We have no way of knowing that vanilla ice cream is better than chocolate ice cream. But I think that's kind of the idea, right? If that's the case, if you have no way of arbitrating between two different ethical codes, then you have no way of having one as a preference over the other, unless you can provide some standard to do this. And I'd say one interesting way people try to get around this is appeal to consensus. Well, let's just agree with what most people believe and set that as our moral code. But I don't think that solves the problem, because you wouldn't appeal to consensus for ice cream flavors. You wouldn't say, oh, vanilla is a better ice cream flavor than chocolate because most people prefer vanilla over chocolate. Or you wouldn't say, like, in the United States, white people make up 54% and Asians only make up 7%, therefore white people are somehow better than 7%. To me, that doesn't make any sense. Just because something is preferred by more people doesn't necessarily make it more true or better. And that also doesn't justify why you should even care about consensus in the first place. For me, certainly, I like cookies and cream, and it's not everyone else's favorite flavor of ice cream, but that doesn't matter to me. So we're kind of back to this sense. So then, of course, what do we actually mean when we're using emotional language? I think when most people say X is wrong, and the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy talks about this, they actually want this claim to be taken as a proposition, not a statement of preference. And I'd argue the reason for this is if they wanted it to be taken as a statement of preference, they would use preferential language. They'd say, I like X. So if you don't believe rightness or wrongness exists, or if you believe that all moral claims are false or just statements of emotion, then I would say commit to using this language. Either commit to using this language, or in the sort of discussion around university and truth, don't say that certain things are right or wrong to change their behavior if you don't actually believe that these are real properties. I'd prefer it if you didn't rape. You can't say rape is wrong because you don't believe wrongness is a real property of the universe. So the best you can do is I'd prefer it if you didn't, or I don't like it. But then, of course, the question is, does that give anyone else a duty to change their behavior? That's a different sort of question. And I don't know about you, but to me, there's just something so deeply unsatisfying. There's just something so like, man, I want to do so much better. But to me, if that's the best we can do, we have to commit to using moral language, or we have to commit to trying to manipulate other people's behavior to our own preferences, which we don't believe we have any reason to prefer to anyone else's, which also is unsatisfying. So kind of gets back to what we're actually saying when we say things are right or wrong, or what language we're using. So to give an example, let's just imagine the following. Imagine I see an item I want at the store, and I'm pretty sure I know I can steal it without getting caught. I can just slip it into my jacket pocket. And let's say furthermore, I estimate that the guilt I feel from stealing, which I'm sure I'd feel some guilt, I know is going to be outweighed by the pleasure I get from having it. So let's say it's a Butterfinger. I like Butterfinger. I know that, I'll feel a little guilty for stealing this Butterfinger, but I also know that that's just kind of a emotional discomfort. I know there's nothing wrong necessarily with stealing. I know that the joy I would have from the sugar rush and eating this Butterfinger are going to outweigh whatever tinge of guilt I feel, especially if I can tell myself that the guilt I feel isn't actually anything real, is just kind of this accidental byproduct of natural selection or whatever. So let's say I decide not to steal it because I want to live in accordance with my make-believe principles. Fair enough. Not the most rational course of action, because once again, you're denying your own values or what you want in accordance for something that's changing your behavior that you don't believe has any epistemic warrant or it doesn't have any value. It's fine. But let's say we can tweak the example. Let's say your friend sees an item that they want, and they know they can steal it without getting caught. And they know that the guilt they feel from stealing is outweighed by the pleasure they get from having. So rather than me, it's my friend Mark who wants a candy bar, and he's thinking about stealing it, and he knows that he can steal it. Mark asks me, okay, Paul, should I steal this item? Do I convince him not to steal? Let's say I'm a moral nihilist, right? Convince him, yeah, don't steal. It's wrong. Now I'm using him as a means to my own ends, because I don't actually believe wrongness is a real property of the universe. I'm basically using him for my own pleasure. I know I can't give him a good reason not to steal. I know stealing isn't wrong, but I'm still trying to change his behavior in accordance with my own principles. No, or I basically don't convince him to steal because nothing is immoral. And both of these kind of seem unsatisfactory to me. So we ask the question, is there anything really wrong about stealing? Is there anything really wrong about any of these things? And here's, of course, the challenge to naturalistic moral realism. So these are the sort of the challenges, if you're a naturalist and a moral realist, are the sorts of questions that are difficult, I think, to answer. But if you can't answer, then you can provide a good baseline moral realism under naturalism. So first is just accounting for the ontological status. So how is it possible that moral facts exist objectively, outside of the world? Let's say you're not a relativist. You just believe that there's such a thing as right or wrong. So the first thing I think you need to do is demonstrate how these can exist under naturalism, especially in light of Mackie's argument from queerness. I think asserting that they exist under naturalism, I would say the ball is kind of in your court and you bear the burden of proof if you're making the assertion that they exist. Of course, if I'm making the assertion that they're incompatible, I need to provide evidence for that too. That's the thing, right? It's not just they have the burden of proof to show that they're compatible. I also have the burden of proof if I'm making the claim that moral realism and naturalism are incompatible for doing that. And that's where I would cite both Mackie's argument from queerness, Richard Joyce's contemporary metaethical works on evolutionary debunking arguments, to say, hey, look, it's possible that we have moral emotions even without moral emotions tracking any truth value. So anyway, thing number one, ontological status of moral properties. Thing number two, and this is interesting, this gets into moral epistemology. How is it possible that our moral senses or moral faculty actually track these true propositions or statements? So it's not enough to just say, okay, well, there are these moral properties that exist. We also need to explain how it's possible that our moral sense is able to sort of come into contact with those properties. And here's where I think the teleology comes in. You can do what I think Sam Harris tries to do, and I respect him greatly for trying to do this, to say, well, maybe we can reduce harm to this neuroscientific approach to brain states. That may be true and that may be possible, but we have Hume's is-ought distinction again, saying I should care about this or I should do something about it now that I've recognized that certain brain states are more cause, discomfort or displeasure than others. What is my teleology for caring or for changing my behavior? And what impetus does this have to make me act? And furthermore, how do we arbitrate between two conflicting moral claims? You could make the argument that, oh yeah, our moral senses track true propositions or statements, and that's fine. But there seems to be disagreement about what the right thing to do is in different circumstances. There seems to be a difference between what a consequentialist thinks and what a deontologist like Kant would say we need to do. So if we have these two different conflicting moral claims, how do we arbitrate between them? And how is it possible that we have two conflicting moral claims if our moral senses are actually tracking true propositions? Because that would seem, if some of these are contradictory, that some moral statements are true and others are not. And if you're a moral nihilist, all of them are false. But if some are true and some are not, how do you know which ones are true and which ones are not? Now let's assume 1 and 2 are true. We can ask the question, what is the nature of my obligation to follow these rules? So just because moral facts exist and that my moral sense actually tracks them, do I have to follow it? Is there an impetus to get this to change my behavior? And I think you can make this argument with evolution when it comes to reproduction. You can say, okay, we have a natural inclination to wanting to reproduce by biology. This is the evolutionary argument. And we have a desire to, let's say, have sex because we want to reproduce. So therefore, you can make the teleological claim that humans should have sex. But does that actually, just because that's the natural thing or what comes out by nature, does this actually obligate me to have sex or to have unprotected sex or to actually have children? An obligation is kind of a different sort of thing, a duty and obligation. And then here's number 4, which is I think the main challenge, which we can say is how convenient. It's very convenient that these naturalistic moral values that we come up with somehow coincide with these Western Christian values and include ideas such as equality, dignity, freedom, etc. With the idea, of course, in the history of ethics, this modern egalitarian, this modern equality of the sexes, these sorts of things, came from this fundamental assumption that God loved all human souls equally. And I can put a citation for where that historical belief came from, right? So if our reason for believing this is let's say we deny the existence of God, we don't believe God exists, how do we still accept the conclusion if we don't accept the premise? And if we don't accept the premise, how convenient is it that we're still accepting the same conclusion? How do we make this not seem like special pleading? I think this is the challenge here. And I'd say, well, you probably should care about these moral things. You should care. Some people try to say, well, everyone cares about human flourishing or a well-functioning society, but then you still have the same question. Why should I care? Especially if I don't care. Especially if this is the only life I have and I experience my own pleasure and pain different from how I experience the pleasure and pain of future generations or other people or other societies. Does that really give me a reason to care? And will society stop functioning if I break the rules? Even if I do care about society functioning, society's not going to fall apart if I don't pay my taxes, if I lie on my taxes or these sorts of things. So once again, gets to be challenging to say somebody who doesn't care, to try to convince them to care, if you believe there are no reasons you can give to get somebody to change their behavior. Then we can, of course, ask the question, why does what God says or wants actually matter? I think this is a fair question too. Just because God says it or God provides a teleology, do we have any reason to follow it? I'd say most theists and most Christians are actually fine with this, because at least it means it's true. At least it means my moral sense can be functioning properly, can be true. Maybe that's good enough. Maybe not being deceived is good enough. You can argue if you take Christian belief seriously, then you can say there's a very good reason to follow God's commands. Not only are you going to be happier yourself by doing this, but maybe you could make some argument, okay, well, in the next life, you get into heaven and God wants to create this community of as many people as possible that are all going to get along. So if you kind of bring yourself up according to this virtue or teleology that God provides, you have a good shot at being accepted into this sort of everlasting kingdom or community. So I would say the theist has a good reason to care. The theist should care. I think the alternative to this is just desirism, which is basically saying, I wouldn't like if you did X and Y and not Z. So once again, how can we establish this teleology which will influence our behavior and will decide what a good human is if we don't believe these exist? If you believe God exists, then you of course believe that there could be a teleology, or if you believe, more strongly, if you're a Christian or a Muslim or a Jew, then you actually have books that are revealed or at least inspired by God so that you can understand what God wants, and that's actually true. Otherwise, what is rightness or wrongness? And if you doubt the epistemology of any religious belief completely, then how do you get around this? And here's an interesting quote from Kai Nelson, who's an atheist. I find this quote really interesting, and he basically says, this is in his book Ethics Without God, it is more reasonable to believe such elemental things, such as torture, wife beating, or child molesting, that's what he basically says in the previous sentence, to be evil than to believe any skeptical theory that tells us we cannot know or even reasonably believe any of these things to be evil. And he also says, and I cut this part out, but he also says that, well, we should also deny that we can't know these things if we don't know God. But I don't think that's, I think what I believe in Christianity says we can know these things even if we don't know God. We can know things are right and wrong. St. Paul says, basically, the law is written on our hearts. We kind of know, or at least have the ability to know, in some sense, what's right and wrong, even without necessarily needing to know God. So I took that out not because I'm trying to be sort of nefarious or anything, but because I don't think it's an important distinction, but I will mention it. Basically, he says, I believe this is bedrock and right, and anyone that doesn't believe it can't have probed deeply enough into the grounds of his or her moral beliefs. Really interesting quote from Kai Nelson. I gained a lot of respect for him for admitting this, because to me, this is one of the things, and I kind of agree with him, but it's one of the things that I think comes at a cost to naturalism. If naturalism implies moral nihilism, as I believe and some other philosophers believe, then do you have a choice? This goes back to the question I asked earlier, between believing in naturalism or believing some other metaphysical stance that allows for at least the possibility of moral realism. Once again, I'm not trying to make an apologetics argument. I'm just trying to say it's interesting that Kai Nelson, if he was given this choice, and he's an atheist and a naturalist, that he would actually choose moral realism. I find that really interesting. If I was given that choice, man, I don't know what I'd choose. Well, obviously I'm a Christian, so I don't really have to choose. But the other interesting thing, and this is something to think about too, this choice may depend on who you are. So, and I was saying this, and I've been talking to some ethicists about this, and at least emailing them. And I was making this observation that, well, it's easy for me to accept moral nihilism because I'm kind of a white man. And I don't mean that I'm not trying to make an epistemological argument here that, all of a sudden things are different. But if I was a woman and I had to worry about, like, being raped or something, or if I was black and I had this history of being, a more recent history of being enslaved, right? Like, of being enslaved, I think it would be a harder sell to convince me that these things don't objectively exist, or they don't objectively exist outside of how we feel about them. Or if relativism is true, the society that had slaves was no better than our society now because it was a different society and it had its own relative culture, and that was fine. I think there would be something deeply unsatisfying about that to me. And I wonder if I grew up with that history, if I would be even more or even less inclined to naturalism if I thought it entailed moral nihilism. So, and once again, I'm not trying to make any postmodern arguments. I really even hesitated bringing that up, but it's an interesting food for thought. Couple references. Anyway, thanks for watching. Please, if you have any questions or you have a response, make a video or put something in the comments, and I'd love to engage and continue this conversation and develop my own views on this. I really wish I could just talk to people in person about this, but I don't know. I try to. I really do try to, but I'm also kind of opening this up because I'm wanting to see humanist responses and learn a little bit more about what y'all believe too. So I believe that's an important thing. So yeah. Anyway, thanks for watching. I look forward to what y'all have to say about it. Thanks.